Well, the greyhound racing industry is heading to court to challenge the racing minister's decision to ban the sport from July next year.
The government is facing fresh legal action over the scrapping of the Māori Health Authority.
5 major unions are taking the government to the High Court over changes to pay equity laws.
A Lake Alice torture survivor is taking the government to court, saying its compensation to victims of abuse in state care is abysmal and also illegal.
Kia ora, I'm Amanda Gillies, and today on The Detail, the government is being accused of bulldozing through major reforms without proper consultation. From banning greyhound racing to changes in pay equity to scrapping the Māori Health Authority and even the redress scheme for state abuse survivors. Ministers have been accused of sidelining the public and cutting corners on process. So, is this government acting improperly or even unlawfully?
Its death was swift.
We've been ripped off by this government.
And personal.
He has let us whānau down and he has let us whakapapa down today.
The Māori Health Authority axed under urgency just days before the Waitangi Tribunal could hold an urgent inquiry into the policy.
The ban is politics at its worst. The government took only a few short months to make a decision that takes away the livelihoods and lifestyles of generations of Kiwis based on selective information.
Malcolm Richards is continuing his fight for justice against the Crown.
Someone's got to say enough is enough and you can't walk over us anymore.
So today I talked to newsroom political editor Laura Walters about what is really going on.
This government has used more urgency and at least truncated more select committee processes than other recent governments.
She has covered the story extensively and has been in court for hearings. And she says it all kicked off when Racing Minister Winston Peters announced greyhound racing would be banned.
It's all over for greyhound racing in New Zealand. Racing Minister Winston Peters has announced plans to phase out the sport over the next 20 months. There have been 3 critical reviews of the sport in recent years, all raised concerns about animal welfare. A review in 2017 found more than 1,440 dogs were euthanised in just 4 years.
This is not a decision that is taken lightly, but is ultimately driven by protecting the welfare of racing dogs.
And when he did that, he basically came out and said, and as part of that, we're going to introduce legislation under urgency, push it through the House to ensure that we don't have members of the greyhound racing community going and euthanising these dogs ahead of that kind of substantive ban coming into place. Now, while there had been this long-running discussion about the industry, about its social licence, this announcement kind of came out of the blue, and the industry has said that it was blindsided, that it didn't get any heads up from the government, that it wasn't consulted on this ban or how this process would work. And so it felt quite aggrieved and put out, and it has maintained that the government didn't follow the proper process to go about banning greyhound racing in New Zealand, that the process has been unlawful, that they weren't consulted in the right way, that there were mechanisms set up that the government should have used and should have gone through.
So the greyhound racing industry took the government to court, arguing it should have been consulted and that information was cherry-picked to suit a narrative. It said the decision affected the livelihoods of more than 1,000 New Zealanders. Round 1 of legal proceedings has now been completed.
The government said, no, we have the prerogative to do this. The court has no place to intervene here because of that very important separation between the judiciary and the executive, so between those different branches of government. They say, no, the court has no place here to intervene. And so far, in this first round, the court has agreed with the government. So greyhound racing has not been successful in its first bid to kind of pause this work, to wind down the industry. And then we will see another substantive hearing on these issues come November.
The thing is, this is not just a case about the greyhound racing industry, because I want to go through the other cases, starting with 5 unions had filed legal proceedings over the government's pay equity changes.
Well, thousands of people across the country have taken to the streets demanding pay equity for women.
Passionate and angry at the government for winding back pay equity legislation.
Laura, tell us about this.
I think we'll all remember those pay equity changes. I mean, I'd be surprised if anyone doesn't. You remember just before this year's budget, the government came out and, again, using parliamentary urgency. So that means that in this case, there was no select committee process. The announcement was made, the bill was introduced, and within about 24 hours, it was passed into law, to overhaul the pay equity regime that had been in place in the pay equity legislation. And the unions have said since that, and as part of that legislation that came through, it scrapped the 33 current claims, the 33 claims covering things like librarians and aged care workers and teachers and nurses, all of these different workforces. Those 33 claims were scrapped. So this came in, again, out of the blue, rushed through under urgency. Those claims were scrapped. And then the unions have since said, basically, we don't think, other than the nurses' union that has now filed 2 claims, the first union to do so, the rest of the unions have said, we don't think we can bring a successful claim under this new pay equity legislation and regime. So they have, again, looked around and said, well, if we didn't have the opportunity to go through the parliamentary process, we weren't consulted, we didn't get the chance to submit to a select committee because there was no select committee process. So where else do we get a hearing? Where else do we talk about this, the process that was followed, the lawfulness or not of that process, and where can we find out more information and essentially get a fair hearing? And so those 5 unions have turned to the courts, again, filed an application to the High Court there where they will have a look at whether the process that the government followed in order to enact this legislation was lawful or not.
And the courts have been busy because Māori health providers have also been in court.
We're taking a claim to the High Court because we disagree with the way that Te Aka Whai order was disestablished.
And they're free to do what they want to do. We've already made the decision as a government that we're disbanding the Māori Health Authority.
Laura, why? What's the outcome here been?
Yeah. I mean, it's the list is getting long, isn't it? It's again a similar thing, a political policy that was taken to the election to scrap the Māori Health Authority, that was set up under the previous government. So again, they came in, they went through that process, and now the Māori health providers are saying we actually don't think that was lawful, what was done, how it was done. So we are going to go to the High Court and seek a declaration of inconsistency with not only the Bill of Rights Act, but also under Te Tiriti of Waitangi. So that would be the first time that a High Court has been asked to declare that potentially that a law or a piece of legislation is inconsistent with Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Obviously, those matters usually sit in the Waitangi Tribunal. So, again, a group of people and providers within the community who feel aggrieved by not just what this government has done, but how they have done it and whether they have done it in a lawful way, gone through a lawful process that is consistent with, those really important pieces of kind of constitutional legislation like the Bill of Rights Act and, other parts of our pseudo-constitution like the Treaty of Waitangi. So again, it's another group that has said, we don't feel like we got a fair hearing through Parliament. Where else can we go? Can we argue this case somewhere else? Will the courts take a different view, and will they give us more ability here, I guess, to influence lawmaking and that lawmaking process?
And just before I go on to sort of government response and sort of public feedback, there's also a state abuse survivor is seeking judicial review. What are the details?
Yeah, so a Lake Alice survivor, Malcolm Richards, has also taken the government to court, and at the moment everyone's waiting with bated breath for that decision that has been reserved by the court. And this is over the government's redress scheme that they've set up. So he's basically saying that we need an urgent judicial review into the Lake Alice redress scheme. He says that it fails in its obligation to provide for adequate and appropriate redress for these survivors, and that the redress scheme is not in line with the International Convention on Torture. So he's again gone to the High Court and has argued his case against what the redress scheme that the government set up in the wake of that Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care. And we'd expect, that they're going through the redress process at the moment with Lake Alice survivors. So we would expect to see that judgment out pretty soon before the whole redress process wraps up in the next couple of months.
Now, you've been doing this job for a while. You're a political editor. How unusual is it, Laura, for a government, the coalition government, to push through significant reforms without, proper consultation or, say, select committee scrutiny?
All governments do it, and it's very easy to fall into this kind of recency bias. When you see it happening now and in front of you, you think it's the worst thing and it's worse than any other government has done before. And I understand that, and we should scrutinise things that are in front of us now. But all governments have used urgency. All governments use it, and all opposition parties almost always, rail against it. But what we have seen through data that Newsroom has gathered, with the help of the Parliamentary Library and others, is that this government has, on most metrics, used more urgency and at least truncated more select committee processes than other recent governments. We always kind of see a bit of a surge of the use of urgency when you get a new government coming into power, when they've, when there's been a big switch from, a left-wing government to a right-wing government. We want to come in, we want to put in place our agenda, we want to urgently repeal a whole lot of laws that the previous government put in place. It's not good, it's not right, but that is quite normal. Like, that's what has become the norm, unfortunately, I guess, in New Zealand. But we've seen as this government's term has gone on, and, we're almost kind of 2 years in now, that use of urgency has continued. The truncation or complete bypassing of select committee processes in some situations. We also have seen that there's been more of a trend towards what we call regulatory impact assessments that don't entirely meet or only partially meet the standards expected. And often there are comments in those where officials have said, we didn't get to consult as widely as we like, so there are limitations in the consultation that went into preparing this policy or this piece of legislation or this regulation, or other things as well where they say, well, we didn't actually have enough time because we were under time pressure, so we couldn't fully develop this policy or look at other policy solutions beyond this one. So they're kind of officials that are highlighting that the urgency and the pace at which the government is moving is actually limiting them in the quality of the work and the quality of the advice that they're able to put before their ministers.
So just so we're clear, what role can the courts play in this, in reviewing the government's actions? Can judges actually overturn legislation? Or is the best they can do is say, oh, look, this is a declaration of inconsistency?
Yeah, there's a very, very important separation there, right, between the different powers or different branches of government, and that's entirely appropriate. So the court's powers are limited, but it's still not nothing.
She says it often comes down to the nature of the case, and sometimes the judge can ask the government to pause something.
They can't ask them to stop something, they can't overturn legislation, they can't order that they change it. That's up to the executive, the government, to make political decisions and set the policy, and then it's up to the whole of Parliament to make those laws, so that the legislature there to make those laws. The judiciary, the courts, cannot step across that.
But they can make declarations of inconsistency.
That might seem like it's just a statement. That's a statement that carries a lot of gravitas. And then Parliament also has to respond to that, and the minister has to respond to that. So when a declaration of inconsistency is made by the courts, it goes back to the Parliament. It has to be put before the House. The minister has to respond to it. There is a debate. It goes to the select committee to have a look and report back, and then the minister again, and the government has to respond to that. So they can't just say, oh yeah, okay, the court thinks we did the wrong thing. Oh, well, we move on now. They then have to go back and, Parliament and government has to re-scrutinise, I guess, that process and that law and potentially change it.
But now the long-time inmate and jailhouse lawyer leading the fight to get prisoners voting rights says the government must change the law immediately after the highest court in the land ruled in his favour. The Supreme Court upheld an earlier High Court decision which says banning all prisoners from voting is inconsistent with the Bill of Rights.
Under the previous government, we saw that lead to a lift in the prisoner voting ban. Of course, those laws are now changing. We're now having a reversal there, but you can see that it can lead to changes and it can lead to outcomes, but the court does not have the power to step over into those other branches of government and force them to do something.
How has the government responded to these claims that, they've acted improper or unlawfully?
You might be able to guess what they've said. They've said that they have not acted unlawfully, that they have followed proper process. And of course, while we're talking about urgency and things like that, while urgency is not well liked by a lot of people and obviously by these communities, it is allowed to be used.
And they argue there is always public interest and or good reason to rush through the laws.
It'll be up to the courts to decide whether a process was imperfect or whether it was unlawful, because I think that a lot of people can agree that not consulting, rushing through under urgency, not having select committee processes is not a perfect process, but is it actually unlawful, and does it reach that threshold that requires the courts to make some kind of declaration or some kind of intervention?
Now, I want to know, all this outrage, the court cases, this is perfect fodder for the opposition parties. What are they saying? Have they waded into this as well?
On greyhound racing, they haven't so much. This work started under the previous government, and I think we could probably assume that if they were still in power, they probably would have gone the same way. They might have done it under a different process. Of course, they've been incredibly vocal on pay equity. They've also been somewhat critical on the state abuse redress scheme, that could have gone further. But there's been some efforts, I guess, to get bipartisan support on that issue. And they were very critical of the scrapping of the Māori Health Authority.
Dr. Iti, like Vini Henare, is someone who I've respected through the years, but he has let his whānau down and he has let his whakapapa down today.
So it's kind of where they stand on the substantive issues. On the process, you do hear the opposition criticise the government a lot on the use of urgency, things being rushed through the House, lack of consultation, lack of proper consultation, I guess, consultation with affected communities broadly before policy is made or before it's introduced. They say it's not enough just to consult once you've already made the decision.
What about public feedback? How sort of damaging is this for the government, and how is sort of the public feeling about it?
A lot of this stuff seems incredibly pointy-headed. And to some degree it is, and it's the experts, it's the academics, it's the people who are intimately involved in this stuff and right down in the weeds, who care about each issue and know these things inside out. But you do get a sense from speaking to people that they can see these trends, right? These trends that we've been talking about around whether communities are listened to, whether feedback is sought. They're starting to notice a trend in this space, that this government is keen to move, in their words, at pace and get things done, but at what expense, at what cost, and are they taking people along with them?
Do you think, Laura, that this sort of fast and furious approach will hold? Or do you think public pressure or pressure from the different industries or advocacy groups will eventually force the government to say slow down and consult more?
I think we see it on different topics. That does happen already in some topic areas, especially if a minister has a really good relationship or a constructive relationship with a community, or they listen to them. In some cases, you do see them slowing down, you do see them tweaking policies, but that seems to be in isolated cases. Whether it's going to change the government's approach, it's hard to know. I mean, we kind of thought maybe that the 100-day plan, that was going to be, and that was the most fast and the most furious, or I can't remember the sequel names, Too Fast, Too Furious, whatever it is, that the government was going to get. But we have seen that they've continued to really move quickly through these things throughout, as the term ticks on. Like we've said, it's already been a couple of years here and they are still moving at pace. So whether they're going to slow down, I mean, I don't truly know. Like I say, there are isolated cases when they have hit pause, when they have said, okay, let's pull that out of this broader piece of policy because this bit here needs a little bit more work, or we do need to consult with this community more here, or maybe that legislation's not right and we need to amend it. So they do that in certain cases, but there is this overall trend. I think it will take something really big to get such community pushback that the government would change its overall approach, because this Prime Minister prides himself on fulfilling on his promises, on action, on getting things done, not just talking about them. And on the flip side of it, you can get into situations where governments or ministers just talk and talk and talk about something and never really do anything. So there's got to be a happy medium in there somewhere, or a kind of a happy balance to strike.
Just a last one. Trust in institutions and lawmaking. Do you think this will take a blow with this sort of fast and furious approach where people are thinking, well, hold on, there's no consultation. Can we trust this?
That trust is already being eroded. I think it is being eroded further at the moment. This is a global trend, right? And some of our opinions are, of course, opinions and thoughts and fears and conspiracies are imported from overseas as well. So this is not an issue that's unique to New Zealand, and it's not entirely born out of, what is happening in New Zealand. It's a response to kind of what's happening around the world, but I don't think it helps. We see it with voter turnout being low. We see it with the kind of pushback that we get against some government policies and things like that. You can see it here with these groups who historically would have used the parliamentary process and the select committee process and consultation with ministries to influence policy, who are instead turning to the courts as another place where they might be heard because they don't feel like they're being heard by Parliament and by the executive anymore. So you can see that it is having an impact. I mean, on the flip side of that, you'll also see that there are a huge number of submissions to select committees, like more than ever before, coming through on controversial pieces of legislation. We saw it with the Treaty Principles Bill, we saw it with the Regulatory Standards Bill, we've seen it with others as well. People are, while there might be an erosion of trust in some institutions and in some ways disengagement, we can see low voter turnout in certain elections. On the other hand, we're seeing some people in the community engage for the first time, or engage at a level that they haven't before with these parliamentary institutions, which I think is a really good thing as well. It's people caring and people listening and people understanding more about how these institutions work. And if you can understand how they work, then surely you can understand how to influence them or how to have your voice heard or considered as part of that process.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Laura Walters. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and Davina Zimmer and engineered by Jeremy Ansell. I'm Amanda Gillies. Matua.